For decades, Microsoft and gamers have shared a complicated relationship, one that has swung between dominance, distrust, loyalty, and frustration. To understand the idea of a secret plan to win back gamers, you first have to understand how Microsoft slowly lost the emotional center of PC gaming, even while technically remaining one of its most powerful forces. Windows is still the dominant gaming operating system by a massive margin, yet many gamers feel less attached to Microsoft than ever before. That emotional distance is a crack Microsoft now seems desperate to seal, especially as Linux quietly grows from a niche experiment into a genuine long-term threat. In the early days of PC gaming, Microsoft didn't need to win back anyone. Windows was gaming. DirectX became the backbone of PC graphics. Developers built games assuming Windows APIs. And gamers accepted Windows not because they loved it, but because it was the unavoidable default. Microsoft's dominance was structural, not emotional. You used Windows because every game demanded it, not because Windows made gaming feel magical. That distinction didn't matter at first, but over time it became a liability. As Windows matured, it also became heavier, more corporate, and more focused on productivity and enterprise users. Features gamers didn't ask for were bundled into the OS. Telemetry increased, updates became mandatory, and user controls slowly eroded. None of these changes alone drove gamers away, but together they created a sense that Windows was no longer for gamers, even if it was still required for gaming. This opened a psychological door that Linux had never been able to pry open before. Linux gaming used to be a punchline. No native games, terrible driver support, constant tinkering, and compatibility nightmares made it irrelevant to anyone who just wanted to play. But something fundamental shifted when Valve entered the picture. Valve didn't try to convince gamers to love Linux as an operating system. Instead, it tried to make Linux disappear. Proton, Steam Play, and later the Steam Deck reframed Linux not as an alternative OS, but as an invisible layer that simply runs your games. That distinction changed everything. Microsoft noticed it had to. Suddenly, the idea that gamers might not need Windows anymore was no longer theoretical. Steam Deck sales proved that millions of people were willing to game daily on Linux without even realizing it. Games that once depended on DirectX ran smoothly through translation layers, anti-cheat barriers began to fall. The old argument that Linux can't game stopped working. And for the first time, Microsoft faced a future where Windows dominance in gaming was not guaranteed by default. Microsoft's response hasn't been loud or obvious. There was no dramatic announcement, no declaration of war against Linux. Instead, the company has moved quietly, strategically, and in some ways uncharacteristically humbly. The first clue lies in how Microsoft now talks about gaming as an ecosystem rather than a platform. The language has shifted from Windows gaming to Xbox gaming, from PC exclusive ease to Play Anywhere. This is not accidental. Microsoft is preparing for a world where Windows may not be the only stage that matters. Game Pass is the cornerstone of this strategy. On the surface, Game Pass looks like a Netflix-style subscription for games, but strategically it's far more than that. It decouples gaming identity from operating systems. If you are invested in Game Pass, you are invested in Microsoft regardless of whether you play on Windows, Xbox, cloud streaming, or potentially something else in the future. Microsoft doesn't need you to love Windows if you love Game Pass. That's a radical shift from its historical dependence on OS lock. Cloud gaming reinforces this further. Xbox Cloud Gaming turns hardware and operating systems into optional details. If the game runs in a browser, Linux becomes irrelevant as a competitive platform and more like a neutral host. Ironically, Linux's strength in servers makes it a perfect environment for Microsoft's cloud infrastructure. In this scenario, Linux isn't the enemy, it's the plumbing. Microsoft doesn't fight Linux head, it sidesteps it entirely. But Microsoft hasn't given up on Windows either. Windows OSI, despite its controversies, includes subtle gaming-focused changes that reveal Microsoft's intent. Direct storage, auto HDR, tighter Xbox integration, and performance scheduling improvements are designed to make Windows feel like the best place to game again, not just the necessary one. The goal isn't to block Linux, it's to make leaving Windows feel unnecessary. Another key piece of the plan is Microsoft's evolving relationship with developers. Historically, Microsoft dictated standards through DirectX and expected developers to follow. Now it courts them. Tools are more flexible, engines more cross-platform, and Microsoft-owned studios increasingly ship games that run well across ecosystems. This may seem like Microsoft weakening its own platform advantage, but in reality, it's strengthening its services. If your game is built within Microsoft's ecosystem, using Azure PlayFab or Xbox services, Microsoft wins regardless of where the game is played. Linux, on the other hand, thrives on openness, community trust, and user control. Its appeal to gamers isn't just technical, it's philosophical. Gamers tired of forced updates, telemetry, DRM, and OS bloat see Linux as a form of digital self. The Steam Deck amplified this sentiment by proving that Linux doesn't have to be painful or complex. You can just play games, and the OS stays out of your way. That idea directly challenges Microsoft's historical approach to Windows as a constantly evolving service. The real question is whether Linux can scale this momentum beyond enthusiasts and handheld users. Desktop Linux gaming is still fragmented. Different distributions, package managers, desktop environments, and driver stacks create complexity that scares off average users. While Valve has done an impressive job smoothing the experience, it still relies heavily on Valve itself. Linux gaming's success is currently centralized around one company, one storefront, and one translation layer. That's both a strength and a vulnerability. Microsoft understands this weakness and appears content to wait. Linux gaming improves rapidly, but it also depends on volunteer effort, corporate goodwill, and reverse engineering. Microsoft, by contrast, has virtually unlimited resources, direct access to hardware vendors, and ownership of massive IP libraries. It doesn't need to rush. It only needs to ensure that Linux never becomes good enough to fully replace Windows for the average gamer. One of the most interesting signs of Microsoft's strategy is how friendly it has become toward Linux in general. The Windows subsystem for Linux, open sourcing parts of .NET, contributing to the Linux kernel, and running Azure largely on Linux would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. This isn't altruism. It's adaptation. Microsoft no longer sees Linux as a rival OS to crush, but as an environment to absorb. If Linux gaming grows, Microsoft wants to be inside that ecosystem, not locked out of it. Imagine a future where Game Pass works natively on Linux. Microsoft has never confirmed such a plan, but it also hasn't ruled it out. If that happens, Linux's biggest competitive advantage against Windows vanishes overnight. Gamers wouldn't be choosing between Windows and Linux anymore. They'd be choosing interfaces and philosophies while still paying Microsoft for content. In that scenario, Linux wins technically, but Microsoft wins economically. Linux can fight back, but only if it continues doing what Microsoft can't easily replicate: trust. Linux users trust their systems in a way Windows users often don't. They believe their OAs won't spy on them, force ads into menus, or change behavior without consent. That trust is fragile, but powerful. If Linux distributions manage to standardize gaming experiences without sacrificing user freedom, they could create a genuine alternative rather than a workaround. Another battleground is hardware. Microsoft's control over Windows gives it leverage with OEMs, but Valve's success with the Steam Deck proves that custom Linux hardware can succeed. If more manufacturers follow Valve's lead, offering Linux-first gaming devices, Microsoft could find itself reacting rather than leading. Still, Microsoft owns Xbox, and that console ecosystem gives it a unique advantage Linux cannot match. Xbox acts as both a hardware platform and a cultural anchor for Microsoft's gaming identity. The cultural aspect matters more than many realize. Gamers don't just buy platforms. They buy into narratives. Linux gaming's narrative is rebellion, control, and community. Microsoft's narrative is convenience, scale, and content. These narratives appeal to different personalities, but Microsoft's challenge is that younger gamers increasingly value control and transparency. If Microsoft fails to adapt its image, Linux doesn't need to win technically. It only needs to win hearts. Microsoft's secret plan isn't really secret in the traditional sense. It's secret because it doesn't look like a plan at all. There's no single move, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there's a slow repositioning away from OS dominance toward ecosystem dominance. Microsoft doesn't need Windows to win. It needs Microsoft gaming to win. Windows is just one piece of that puzzle. Linux's response, intentional or not, has been to make itself invisible. The less gamers think about Linux, the more likely they are to use it. That's a dangerous trajectory for Microsoft, because invisibility is how platforms become defaults. Windows once benefited from that exact effect. Now, Linux is borrowing that playbook quietly and efficiently. In the end, this isn't a war with a clear winner. It's a long game of erosion, adaptation, and shifting priorities. Microsoft is betting that services, subscriptions, and cloud infrastructure will outlast operating system loyalty. Linux is betting that freedom, performance, and user trust will eventually matter more than convenience. Gamers are caught in the middle, benefiting from better tools, more choice, and unprecedented competition. Whether Linux truly fights back depends less on Microsoft and more on Linux itself. Can it stay user-focused as corporate interest grows? Can it standardize without becoming rigid? Can it welcome new gamers without alienating its core community? Microsoft is watching closely, not with fear, but with calculation. And if history has shown anything, it's that Microsoft doesn't always need to win the first battle to win the war. The most ironic outcome may be one where gamers defect to Linux, only to find that Microsoft is still there, powering their games through services, studios, and subscriptions. In that future, the operating system becomes just another skin, and the real battlefield shifts somewhere else entirely. The fight between Windows and Linux may not end with one replacing the other, but with both being absorbed into a larger ecosystem where the old rules no longer apply. And that may be exactly what Microsoft is counting on